and welcome to the Scaling Therapy Practice. This is James Marland with Dr. David Hall. Hello, David.
Hey, James.
Welcome back to the show. This is the show where we ask people to take small steps that lead to big steps of growth. So this week, we're going to be talking about demystifying CEs and why should you care about them. But first, we're going to talk about our tool, tip, or tech of the week. Do you got a tip for us, David?
Sure. It's something that I keep on coming back to, but and so it's not new in my life, but I've gotten better more in the habit of it recently. But people call them different things. I usually call it like a power 20, or there might be a better phrase for it, and you may come to mind for you, James. But basically, where I'll set a timer to do like this focus interval sort of thing, but I'll set a timer for 20 minutes to really push into whatever task I'm getting through, because I struggle a lot with procrastination. I work all the time, but I also get frustrated with my productivity is very uneven. I can have very productive moments. It's usually when I'm coming against deadlines, and very because I'll check email and I'll refresh email, and I've got multiple emails that I'm in, so there are multiple ones to be checking. Or I'll get on social media, or I'll get on Wikipedia is a big rabbit hole for me. And to kind of do this kind of power 20 is or focus time or whatever it is, but I'll set on my phone typically 20 minutes. And in that, I'll articulate to myself, what am I going to do for this 20 minutes? And be like, okay, I'm going to write out these emails for that I'm going to schedule, or I'm going to work on updating this page on my website, or I'm going to work on getting my psychotherapy notes done, or whatever it is. And I'll set the timer for 20 minutes. And when the alarm goes off, then I'll take a 5-minute break. And that could be get up and stretch, or I'll do a quick walk, or then I'll read this Wikipedia article that I started on about goat yoga, or whatever it is that my ADHD, whatever my ADHD brain was, whatever direction it was taking me in. So yeah, that's just, and I think sometimes it's hard to lean into a habit like that because it feels like such a small thing, but it does, and it improves my mood. I feel better when I'm able to just just get something done.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of that before, and I used to put it on my calendar, things like that. The term I heard is sprints is what it was called.
Yeah.
Like you would sprint hard towards one direction, one main thing, whether it was like writing your email, your outlines, or getting a video post out, or your social media work, or doing your notes, whatever. It's like 20 minutes focused time to get stuff done. The other one that came up when I was doing the program, Run Like Clockwork, they called it the Pomodoro timer. Have you heard of that? It's a tomato timer. A Pomodoro, I guess, is a tomato. But if you look up Pomodoro timer on the internet, you'll find some timers that you can either add to your calendar or just put in your browser and start them. And I think I use a program. It's free, but you can upgrade it, called Clockify. And Clockify has a Pomodoro timer, I think, built in. I'd have to check that. But that is such a great tip, because you get more done when you remove the distractions and focus. When you said getting caught in the rabbit hole of work that's not work type of stuff, that is me to a T.
Yeah. So what's your tip?
My tip is kind of low tech. If I was going to put a business spin on it, I would say take time to take breaks and have some fun during your day. And my fun for the last week has been taking this Nerf rival gun. It's a Nerf gun, but it shoots small bouncy bullets, like Nerf bullets. And shooting them shooting them so the cat chases them, basically. So I have a lot of fun watching the cat look at the bowl, bounce back and forth.
Mhm,
I might be eating my sandwich for lunch, shooting the Nerf
mhm,
balls at the ceiling and watching it bounce up and down, up and down, up and down, and the cat going crazy,
mhm.
trying to figure out where's the ball going next. It's been a lot of fun. I want to shout out to my brother Brian, who is he's heavy into Nerf guns, so he modifies his Nerf guns, makes them shoot bigger, faster, like with
That's
stronger
I've never I don't know
batteries.
if I ever heard anybody who modified Nerf guns, so this is a first for me.
Yeah, I'm sure if you wanted to go down the rabbit hole on YouTube of how to do it,
I'm sure.
you can find people who do it. But yeah, it's been way more fun than than I thought it would be,
Mhm.
just for the cats, but also uh my son took it and shot me and he loved that. So we kind of palled around, but now I need more Nerf guns. Like I think you need multiple Nerf guns for this type of thing. So I'll update you in a couple months on how that went and how far down the rabbit hole I go with Nerf guns. But
That's a big thing for my nephews is Nerf guns, and
oh,
I was one of the first generations of in my childhood is when Nerf was new, and there were
mm,
a lot of Christmases where that was a big
oh
a
yeah,
lot of hauls of that, and, man, we my brothers and I would really that was big in our world. That and
oh
Super Soakers. We were the
yep,
first generation of
Super
Super
Soakers for
Soakers.
sure.
Yeah.
And oh, what was I gonna say? Nerf battles. Okay, well,
Yeah.
it's been a lot of fun. So I
Yeah.
recommend my tip is just have some fun. If you need a Nerf gun to have fun, do it. Maybe buy some Nerf guns for your office.
Mm.
See, I don't know, maybe not, but
Depends
yes,
on how your office feels, and maybe
depending on the office, just
yeah,
have some fun. I
yeah.
do have a church that they would have the youth pastor would he would hide Nerf guns around the church and,
Mhm.
have Nerf battles with people randomly in the big building. It was that sounds like fun. Oh, you're never gonna boy. I do not feel like boys ever grow out of the toy, the
Mhm.
toy buying toys.
Yeah.
They just get bigger. Like you just find bigger toys to buy.
No, it is. I've been in conversations with some men in my life of peer age, and we've been talking about cars and things like that, and it really does become, big boy
Big
go-karts
boy
in a certain
toys. Yeah.
yeah, big boy toys, and it is interesting of just how you can grow, but not necessarily completely grow up, but that's okay, because in this, as we talk about, this is generally a podcast where we talk about work, and I generally enjoy work. I don't enjoy all of work,
Mm,
but, you know, I I know that I enjoy work because when I go on vacation, I think about and
hmm
not like in sometimes I will say sometimes I'm taking time off and the thoughts about work are pressured thoughts of stress. More often than not, it's usually more
mm,
dreaming about something to build or dreaming, creative process, and that's where I feel really, uh, blessed in what I get to do is a lot of my work allows me to be creative, which is something I really enjoy, and, uh, it's not all that, and there's a lot of rote, um, chores sorts of things in it, but, I feel and part of the scaling process is a creativity process of either you scale because you're creative and your creative solutions endeavors are the things that allow you to scale, or because you scale successfully and more efficiency or other things like that, you have more space in your life to be creative.
hmm
And but I guess that's a lead into what you wanted to talk about today because yeah,
Yeah.
you had the idea to talk about something that has been a big scaling thing in my journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been just because of podcasting and some other things, I've been in contact with a lot of creative people, people making things, people going to conferences, and one of the things that always comes up is like can we get CEs out of this? Like
Mm,
can you offer CEs? How do you offer CEs? Why do you offer CEs? Like all those things. Can you make money doing it? And so, um, one of the big reasons I connected with David, and he had a course on this, and it's a story about how he has been able to have a school that offers CEs. Anyways, I'll let him tell the story. But David, what's your story about earning CE accreditation?
Yeah, and for those tuning in who depending on who you are, where you are, you're wondering like,
What is a
are they
CE?
talking about like certified empanadas and continuing education? For those who
Continuing education.
continuing education. So
Okay.
if if you are a licensed or credentialed therapist in most places in the world, and talking specifically about the United States, usually part of your if it's a license or a certification or whatever it is, usually part of maintaining that is completing a certain number of continuing education hours in your renewal period. It's different for different licenses in different states. It's not universal. In the United States, there are a few exceptions for places where you have of earning continuing education, but it is nearly universal. So that's what it is we're talking about. So I um my journey into this was the first time I guess I delivered CE content was pretty soon after beginning my career as a therapist. I had just graduated and I went to a conference with one of my professors who was a mentor of mine, and I was working for him some. And I'd actually collaborated on a recent book he had published. And he was speaking at this counseling conference, and the topic was on the book, and I co-presented with him. And this was people attended this workshop and got continuing education credit for it. And that was my first time doing something like that, and I liked it. And I got a lot of positive feedback from people who were attending, people I knew, people I didn't know.
Mm.
And I had a background before I became a therapist. I had a background in performance sorts of things. I did theater, drama things when I was a kid, and I'm a musician, and so would do music performances. And so I had a certain background in performance sorts of things, and I think I kind of carried that over in being a presenter. And I liked it. It energized me. I'm an extrovert, and that was an energizing activity for me. And I thought, well, this is cool. And then pretty soon I began to develop a vision for, well, how can I do this as a means of income? I enjoy therapy, like being a therapist, but this because I began meeting people that were making a living doing workshops and presentations in these sorts of contexts. And so my initial plan was, how do I put myself out there in such a way where I can be hired by these institutes or organizations? Most therapists will be aware of PESI, which is a big national brand that does CE trainings, and they do them live and online. And when I was starting, there was another company too called Cross Country that uh, was bought by PESI in the year since, and there a few others you may come across. You'll get mailers, and so I knew things existed. The problem was I was a really young therapist. I hadn't even finished my doctorate at this point. Not that you need a doctorate to do this, but I was lighter on credentials at that point. I hadn't published a book. I wasn't I didn't have a lot of name recognition. I was not a really hireable commodity. I could get a little bit because I had some interesting topics, and I was engaging enough as a presenter, I think, but I wasn't high on people's lists when they were looking at like, how do we bring somebody in to do this conference? That wasn't me. So because I couldn't get hired very easily, I began exploring the process of like, well, how do I build this myself? So in 2011, I started my first continuing education project. And at this point, I didn't know anything about how to go about the process. I really just began doing research of what were the different approval organizations that approved continuing education, what was necessary, and going through that. And I just kind of fumbled through the process. And I've been doing it now, as I said, since 2011, and learned a
Can
lot.
I, can I ask a layperson question?
Sure.
There's multiple agencies to get credentialed with.
Oh, yes.
And they each have their own requirements.
Yes.
And does each discipline need different things for?
Yes, but it's different in different states. And if you're asking, like, there's overlap. And
Okay.
so here's the
So there's a process. Is there a preferred process of getting accredited?
that depends. That's the
Oh.
answer for a lot of things. But so I will so to lead into kind of make this next question of like, well, what are the processes?
Okay, yeah. What are the yeah, that's where I was going
Yeah.
because you're saying things about like different agencies, different boards, different requirements. So that yeah, what's the process?
It is multi-layered, multifaceted, and this is one of the things where I've had to learn a lot, and I know a lot on this. Probably, if you're interested in kind of knowing what it looks like in the United States, at least, if you go to the group I work with now, Psych Maven, if you go to our website, psychmaven.org, and go under the continuing education tab, there's a free download that we have on there talking about the continuing education requirements for every discipline in every state, in all 50 states. And every state has 4 main disciplines of mental health. This is even excluding addiction counselors because that's a different qualification, but just in mental health. Every state has some equivalent of clinical social worker, psychologist, marriage and family therapist, professional counselor slash mental health counselor. Like every state has something of that. And each of them have different CE requirements. And I've done consulting with groups where they'll say, we want to do CEs for therapists. I'm like, okay, what therapist groups between psychologists or social workers? They're like, all of them. I'm like, okay, what states do you want it in? All the states. And I tell people, I go, that is a ridiculous thing to do. I don't try to say it in a way that they're ridiculous, but that is a very, very hard thing to do and not economically feasible for most organizations. Now, that doesn't mean in every state you have to get 4 things for every like, it's not an endless list. And depending on who you are and where you start, like, you can start pretty simply depending on who you are and where you're working. So, I guess the biggest question would be is where? So, if someone's saying, like,
Yeah,
"I wanna begin the process," I would ask the first question, "Where are you?" So, for example, James, you were in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So, um, Pennsylvania is a middling state in as far as how flexible like, certain states are more flexible in
Mhm.
their requirements for continuing education, and other ones are pretty stringent.
Question.
Yeah.
If I get certified in Pennsylvania, does that mean I can only teach Pennsylvanians,
Nope.
or what does that mean?
Nope. It does not mean it doesn't mean exclusivity because Pennsylvania doesn't have a state process.
Oh,
Other state
okay.
again, James, this is complicated. This
I
is
That's
why
why I'm asking
yeah,
you.
this is why. So, I will give you the extremes of simple
Okay.
to easy.
Okay.
So, one of the simplest states to do continuing education is Colorado.
Do you have to
Col
live in Colorado to get
You have
a
to be licensed in Colorado.
you have
Like,
to be licensed in
this is
okay.
for a Colorado licensure. And so,
Okay.
you're a Colorado licensed therapist in most disciplines. Typically how they do it, they do, they call it continuing professional development, CPD in there, and you keep a log.
Okay.
And, and so basically you're responsible as a license holder to maintain and this is as of 2023 when we're recording this. Things change, but this is what it is currently. You don't have to have events you attend don't have to have any particular approval or accreditation. They just have to be structured in ways to meet, that clearly this is a professional learning
Mhm.
environment. And you have to keep a log of what you're learning and what the learning objectives were and things like that, and that goes through periodic audits. Um, but that means if I was a Colorado-based therapist looking to do a continuing education training in Denver,
Mhm.
marketing to other people in Colorado, I wouldn't necessarily have to go through the approval process of, you know, doing something. I would just have to structure my event in such a way that it's meeting development standards in that this is a therapist learning environment. So that's one end of easy. We'll go to the other end, New York.
Okay.
New York, each discipline in New York has their own licensing board. And to do an event for a profession in New York, you have to get approval from each of the 4 disciplines to market to that discipline. So if I'm doing something in New York and I want to invite social workers, licensed clinical social workers, I have to go through an application process and get approval from the New York State Board of Social Work. And it's an expensive approval process. And that allows me in New York to give CEs for social workers. But if I want to give them to to mental health counselors, I have to go through the mental health counseling
Mm,
and do that. Like that is one of the New York probably, if not the most, it probably is the most or near it, most restrictive sort of thing. So those are the 2 extremes, James. But there's a lot in the middle.
yeah.
So I'll give you something. So the question, and people maybe are already thinking, this feels so overwhelming. This says, where do I
Mhm.
begin? What do I do? Like, so what I would start is, who are you? Where are you doing this? Pennsylvania's kind of middling. I'll give Tennessee though. Tennessee is where I am, and this is the most. So let's say I wanted to do an event. The first thing I did as an approval process, it's still my main approval, is the national approval body for counselor continuing education. It's the National Board for Certified Counselors, NBCC. And they have a whole approval process of offering continuing education events or becoming a continuing education provider. I went through the first event I did, I went through approval with them. Now, the laws in Tennessee meant that approval allowed me to do CEs for counselors, but also for marriage and family therapists and social workers.
How did you
And
know that law? Did you have to look it
I had to
up?
look it up.
You had to look up
You had to
who
look at,
can
and
I
that
do and where do you find that?
well, that's the guide I have. If you go to
Okay.
sitemaven.org and the CE tab, Continuing
So you've
Education
done the
tab,
work.
I've done the work. That
Yeah.
represents that
I've
guide
seen that
represents,
sheet. It's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah, it represents well over 100 hours of research of going to each state board. Because what it is in a lot of states, the approval of one discipline will count for another.
Mm,
I'll go back to the New York thing too. Even though that's a kind of a pain in the rear to get, one of the benefits of giving New York approval, say for social work, is certain states will count the CEs for other state boards. So say if I'm doing a CE event in Georgia, Georgia will count for social worker continuing education, the approval of another state. So I can get approved in New York, and if I have that approval for that event and I'm delivering the training in Georgia, that helps me market to Georgia social workers because they'll accept the approval of other states. Now, not all states have their own approval process. Most don't. A few do. California has a composite board approval process, as I said. New York does for their different ones. Florida has one for both their psychology board, and then they have a combined board for their master's level ones.
mhm.
And the benefit, I recommended people go through, get approved in Florida. They're like, well, I'm not in Florida. I'm like, well, it doesn't matter because you're doing this in a state where the state will account the approval of another state board. And Florida has a pretty streamlined process of becoming an approved provider under a lot of their boards. So the benefit of doing that isn't just so I can give CEs in Florida, but I'm giving CEs in states that will approve other state boards.
Cool. That's a hack.
Yep,
That
it
is
is.
that's a shortcut right
Yeah.
there.
So the first thing, if people's heads are already spinning, again, psychmaven.org. James, I'll
I'll put a link in the
put a
show
link
notes
in
for
it, but
sure. Yeah.
it's a download of just it's every link step. Now, sometimes links get broken. I try to keep this document updated, but at the very least, it will give you kind of a basic guide of what's the requirement, what approvals will get me there. Now, this is an easier thing to navigate. People might be asking, like, okay, I can figure it out if I'm doing an in-person event. What if I want to do it online? and I want a wider audience that may be cross state lines. How do I make decisions? That's a trickier one. You've got to decide like because it's really hard to do something that's going to cover everybody, but you could do stuff that will be pretty widely covering.
Well, yeah, because a test case for me, anyways. I do a lot of online courses. So would you be able to just listening to all the things that are involved? Would you be able to offer a course online would that people from multiple states would be able to be to get the credits for, or would you have to clarify in your course this only fits for Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, and
No,
New
I don't
York?
take the responsibility. I say what I do in any of my courses where I offer continuing education
Mm-hmm.
is we have a list of these are the approval bodies for this course. And it is ultimately the responsibility of the person to like, will this count for me? And I give them a
Okay.
link to the guide. I go, if you're curious about your state, here's the guide, contact your board.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people will email me and oftentimes I'll answer like, I'm a psychologist in this state. And I've done a lot of this research, so I keep a lot of it in my head. So if you're a psychologist if you do an event, let's say you get MBCC approval. So that's the counselor one. A lot of psychologists in states can count it, either partially or whole. So if you are a licensed psychologist in Tennessee and you do an online course that has MBCC approval, you can count a portion of your hours for renewal for that. Not a portion of the class, but like in your renewal process, a certain amount of your hours can be from an accreditor like MBCC. And so I could mark it to you and you could count. Now, if you're at, there, you have to get a certain percentage of your hours has to be APA approved, which is American Psychological Association. But after you have a certain portion of that, the rest can be from other professional associations. So I can mark it to you.
So I'm
It,
assuming most therapists eventually know which boards they can go to, and they look for the symbol or
yeah,
the
they'll look for the symbol and they'll
yeah.
ask. But
Okay.
if you're a psychologist in New Hampshire, you could count all the hours. But if you're a psychologist in New York or Pennsylvania, you can't count any. And people will ask, and I'll get emails will be like, well, does this count for psychologists in Pennsylvania? And my response is pretty boxed. It'll be like, ultimately, you've got to, determine for your own board. My understanding is that
Mm-hmm.
no, it is not.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that will miff people. I'll give people one of a recent launch because currently I don't have approval for psychology nationally. I don't have the national approval for that in my organization. I'd like to get it, but it's a big do. One of the reasons I haven't been super pressured to do it is a lot of psychologists can count it depending on what training's offered, depending on what states they're in and things like that. But I had somebody who's in Minnesota. They're saying, why don't you have APA approval for this? Because I'd love to take this course, but I can't count it for CE credit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I'm genuinely very sorry. 'Cause I am. I want them to be able to take the course and count the credit. I go, "We would like to get this approval in the future, it just hasn't been something we've done so far. Stay tuned." So, I would start if you're looking to do it, I would start with one thing and figuring out what's gonna get the most bang for buck, but there are always gonna be some people that are gonna be excluded, even for groups that do um, a lot of the big national approval bodies. There's certain ones like New York State where the New York State will not count the approval of a national body. You have to do it from the state board. And I think that's a financial thing. I don't think, but so what this means is like for CEs, for the approvals I have, licensed people in New York cannot take my courses for CE credit. And that's not targeted. I feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
I've got my father grew up in New York State. My people are from there. Uh, I I love a lot of aspects of the Empire State. I'm not trying to be exclusionary in that. But for what I do, it's because it's very expensive to get New York approval, and it's not as it doesn't stretch as far
Mm-hmm.
compared to other things, and so you have to make decisions on strategic investment. If you're trying to be in C offerings, if you're trying to be everything to everybody, that's hard.
I mean, that
But
sounds like good advice there.
yeah,
Like, just realize you're gonna have a bandwidth, really.
yeah,
Like, if you had unlimited resources, you could get
mm,
credited in New York, but you could also right now you could spend those resources on some other thing that would give you 10 states or whatever instead
yeah.
of.
And so it's figuring out what they are,
Yeah.
and there's some guidance to this in this free guide, but there are national organizations, there's state organizations, there's some state organizations that will count for other states. That's why it goes to the beginning of my answer. It depends. So where
Okay.
are you depends, and who you're marketing to will depend what approvals you want to get.
So I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but after you do NABCC, what's next?
NBCC,
Whatever. NB, so many letters. Mental
NBCC,
health has lots of letters.
yeah,
What is it? NBCC.
BCC, National Board for
Okay.
Certified Counselors.
There's too many letters. So, okay. So what do you do next? I mean, I know we're not going to teach the course here, but after you get that, what do you think is the next step?
There's marketing and there's gosh, there's a lot. I mean, it's yeah. I know we listed out questions before we started
Yeah, well, what
recording.
do you do with it is sort of like the next question. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
once you get accredited, what can you do with it?
yeah. The Depending on the approval body, there are different flexibilities. A lot of approval bodies will say we're approving you to do live events, and
Okay.
other ones, and that excludes you doing asynchronous or pre-recorded things. And so MBCC, for example, has different approvals for live events versus home study events is what they call them. So Psych Maven, who I work with, is approved to do both. So that allows me to do both. But depending on what approval you have, you decide differently. But
How
let's say
long
if
does
it's
it how long does it last? Sorry, you have approval, but for how long?
I have to do an audit every 3 years.
Okay.
I have to pay them every year. But
Oh, okay. Well, that was gonna be one of my further questions. What does it cost? So what do you have to
I think
pay?
it's $200 typically. It's different for different things. Like New York, if last I checked, I think it was like $800 a year per body, which is another reason why I haven't done New York because
Wow.
yeah. And people ask, is it worth it? It just depends. It just depends. Like if I was a New York based continuing education provider doing a lot of events for a New York based therapist, of course I would do that approval.
Mhm.
But
Well,
the
I worked for a freestanding psych hospital, and they had a nice conference room, and they had things down there weekly. It seemed like they had a person employed to get people in to for speaking engagements, so people could get their CEUs. Um, and they it was Pennsylvania, but I'm sure they paid because it was part of the structure of the business, the support for the community, the support for their own employees. It made sense for them to get that because it just of what the return they got on it. But if you're a group practice owner that's not part of your main business, I'm not sure you'd get quite the return.
or you're a solopreneur or
Yeah.
whatever it is. It's just you could if it's a large enough organization, it could just be part of your marketing costs. But um, so once you do it, you decide like if you want to do something live, I teach this in my course of how to find space to present. You can do anything from a small thing in a conference room. Things don't have to be big. To you rent out church, uh, fellowship hall space. That's a good
Mm.
money saver one for people. Traditionally, before I knew better, I did it a lot in hotels. Why I say before I
Probably charged more money.
Yes, and that was I say before I knew better because it was expensive to do it like that.
Mhm.
But I would travel because I this was in 2014, 2015 era, I traveled a lot to teach. And but I'm self-sponsored, so I would go to other cities and rent out space and
Mm.
market and have people come, and I would typically do in hotel conference room, ballroom spaces, which, were kind of standard in the industry. I just discovered it wasn't a good, um cost-wise, cost-benefit ratio wasn't great, and so I've moved away from that for live sorts of things, and I like thinking more outside the box of, you can rent out any number of, there's, uh, um, community centers to I've seen people do elk lodges. There are a lot of different sorts of spaces that
You're
you
not
can.
just locked into the most expensive
Yeah,
option
yeah,
available. Yeah.
yeah. And it's having Cs. A mistake I see people make is they go through the CE approval process. They're like, okay, I'm going to do this event, and it has CE credit that people can get with it, and that's just they'll be busting down the door.
Mm.
And the answer is no, not in my experience. Um, However, the other side is if you want to do a professional training geared towards other therapists, it's oftentimes hard to sell it if you don't have CE approval. I've done them
Mhm.
before. When I first started, I did the first things I did as events, but before I had finished the approval process, and it was a learning experience. But people ask, "Well, can I get CEs for this?" I'm like, and that affected the sell through.
Got a question for you.
Sure.
Can you go to somebody else's conference and the conference isn't approved for CEUs and your speech is, and you
I've never
could
tried to do that. Hypothetically, I could
okay.
because I have approval in my
You're
organization.
independently
Yeah,
approved for
approved.
this. Yeah.
I wouldn't do that, just because unless there was money involved. Like, it would be, like
Well, let's talk about the money then.
yeah.
What can you do? Like, as part of what can you do with it? What is somebody? What should somebody expect with like earning potential for offerings the CUs? CUs.
Well, what do you think I'm gonna answer to that, James?
It depends on where you
Exactly,
are.
exactly. But I'll finish the thing I was answering
Oh,
before as
sorry. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
'cause this idea of, like, will CEs sell themselves? No,
yeah.
not in my
No,
experience.
no, they don't.
My metaphor for CEs is it's like icing on a cake.
Mm,
It makes the cake more appealing, and if you have an uniced cake, that cake is not very appealing. However, most people aren't that interested in eating a jar of icing, and
yes.
if the
Yep.
only appeal is this has CE credit, that's not a and people if you wanna go online, try to find CEs for therapists cheap, you can. There are
Hmm.
companies that specialize in, like, CEs for less or kin and but people that do that and that's will be this goes into your question of can you make money off this? Because a skepticism that people will have when they are talking to me about it is, "How can I make money off this? Because I saw online that this group is charging $1 per hour, like, how can I make
Yeah.
money if that's the case?" And my retort to that is, I do not trust a $5 bottle of wine. It being cheap does not increase its appeal. In fact, it decreases its appeal. Now, that $5 bottle of wine may be good, but its pricing makes me suspicious. And there's a factor that comes in when you're doing professional trainings that offer CEs to it. And there's a range. I teach this in my course of there's a financial range of like this is kind of where things land. Like and it's usually per hour. Like above this rate, it's really hard to charge above this rate per hour. But if you go below this rate, people will get really suspicious. It's not that people don't go below this rate, but it's and so I have a but that's in the course if I talk about like how to think through pricing. But can you make money off this? Absolutely. I make a significant part of my income off of things I do related to continuing education and have for years. When I would do live events, and I started doing live events, in the early 2000 teens, I would usually make a few $1,000s profit per event. And at the time where I was in my career and things like that was great. And I would go to some place like Atlanta or Charlotte or Dallas or
Mm.
Tampa and do an
Check out
event.
the restaurants there,
Yeah, and
probably,
it was
because
also a
you
way like,
yeah,
my wife would travel with me
yeah,
and
yeah.
and so that was profit. And so that would cover the event expense, the travel expense, things like that, and we'd be able to do a weekend away and make some money. And
Mhm.
it also on the scaling bit, they also built on themselves. When I would do an
Mm.
event and someone would come to it and for the first time, oftentimes that person would stay connected and be interested in things in the future. So yes, absolutely. Like you know, um, it, it's a it's a significant income to make.
the two points on that, the scaling point and the dollar CEs. Uh, the person offering the dollar CEs is probably not your competition. Like
No.
they're offering to the mass market, and they only want the icing. You know, they don't want it feels like to me they don't want the information or the work you put into
Yeah.
your courses and the rich benefit that they're getting out of it, the production value, all the things, the templates, all the things that you put into your courses.
Mhm.
So for somebody thinking about, you know, how can I compete with those dollar people,
They're
you're
not,
not
and it's
competing
just
against them.
yeah. It's Walmart and Target serve different demographics,
Mm,
and and so there's a branding that kind of comes along with things. But to James's point is absolutely true. The people that are usually looking for that are the people scrambling, either
mm,
last minute or and that does affect, like, I keep most of my continuing education offerings are not evergreen. Like, I do a lot of stuff online, but you can't buy them whenever. They're open in certain times with a few exceptions. And some of the stuff I keep available is a lot of people in their CE renewals have to have certain topics covered. So, like, one of the most common is people have to do a certain number of their continuing education has to be in ethics.
mhm.
And so I have ethics courses that I keep up just all year round because I catch people, they're at their renewal. I've got to get my ethics done, knock it out. And I still charge accordingly within my brand. I try to make it high value. If someone's just wanting to get hours for hours sake, what I'm offering isn't, that's not my market, as James' point. And, someone's making a living at that. And I don't want to knock that. It's just not what I'm trying to get into.
Yeah. Um, and then one of the things you said is it scales. Like
Hmm.
I think if you're expecting this sounds like something to me that has to scale, right? Like if you're going
Hmm.
to make money on it, you start out at a certain point, but then you do things that increase the value of your current content and your future content. Can you talk about how it's helped you scale, or the a little
What's
bit
great
of
is you could scale in multiple directions in it.
okay?
So the very first thing I did had 12 people come to it. And people will say, like, "Oh, so you want more people?" Maybe. Depends what you're offering. Um, you can do a 10-person thing or 5-person thing, and it'd be profitable. It just depends what your costs are and what you're charging for. If you're doing, like, a high touch, high transformation thing with a limited number of spots, that can be very,
Mm,
um for example, this someone I talked with, she was doing in-person retreats, teaching people about the Enneagram, and that was a capped number of individuals, but it was like a 3-day thing, and it was a high dollar amount, and so scaling can go to you increase number of participants,
mm,
it could be you increase the pricing. No, there is, like I said, there is a cap based on how long the training is and what you can charge for it. The most expensive continuing education training I'm a part of right now is a what's about to be a 50-hour course.
what? Wait,
Yeah.
did you say 50? Is that 50 CEs?
Yes. Which is a huge amount.
Do you need 50 CEs?
Not usually, not that it's usually overkill for a lot of people, but
Okay.
it's also a certification course. It's
Oh,
for people wanting to learn hypnotherapy.
okay.
And that's priced around the, like, $800, $900 mark.
Hmm.
And it's an online course. If it was in person, you could charge more, but there's a kind of a natural limit because to say, like, I'm doing this and this has 100 Cs, no one needs that many per renewal. And so and that's why, again, go to the guide because it will show you, like, what's a typical renewal amount. Like 40 hours per 2-year renewal is a typical amount for people. Sometimes they'll need more, but uh, but not usually. And so That's the thought process. And so it's a lot of hours, but, and so there is a limit. Like you couldn't charge if you had a 3 CE hour course, charging $900 for it would be a hard stretch.
Mm.
You would have to be very special and very in demand. But scaling does become like doing larger offerings, and so I don't do a lot of short courses anymore. And that's one of the ways that I've scaled. I do a few because I like having some variety for people, and if it's a specialty topic like suicide prevention or ethics or multiculturalism, oftentimes those have certain common hour denominators that people are looking for, and so I try to create things for that. The other way I scale is, I I I coordinate a lot of courses I don't teach. So
Mm.
that hypnosis course, I don't teach that course. That's one that's taught by my friend Bill O'Hanlon, and it's his material. I'm just the organizer for it. I'm the producer. And so you can go through CE approval process and do that, and you don't have to teach at all. Because one of the things I pitch to people is like, if you're terrified of teaching to others, you can still make money off CEs.
So do you have to be a therapist to do that? To get the approval?
Um, it depends on the so
I'm not
I'll
surprised about that answer.
sure. You need different qualifications, yes. So, but I'll give the example for MBCC in 2 levels of it. To get the approval for MBCC, somebody has to be stated on there that has a master's degree in a mental health discipline.
Okay. Somebody on the
Now,
application.
somebody on the application, but it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be the primary applicant.
Okay.
But basically, they want evidence that somebody is qualified to be in this to do this.
But
So,
the
for
person on
example,
the application doesn't have to teach it.
yes. So, for example, James, you in
Yeah.
this.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
maybe I was thinking about myself, but
maybe you were, but let's just
maybe
assume that you were.
let's just
Like, and so if you wanted to apply for approval process with MBCC, and different organizations require different things. If you're applying for APA, which is American Psychological Association, if you're applying for their approval, you have to have specifically a psychologist in the mix.
Mhm.
It doesn't that they don't have to be the main applicant, but you need a psychologist who's part of the review process. Whereas MBCC doesn't say it has to be a counselor, it just has to be somebody with a master's degree in a mental health discipline.
Okay.
Social work, marriage and family therapy, psychology, but somebody who's qualified. But let's say in your brand, James, Course Creator Studio, you're like,
Mhm.
hey, I want to go through the process of getting MBCC approval.
Mhm.
You could do that. You can make an application as long as you had a therapist who was a stated person who was managing the content, but it didn't have to be you
Okay.
in that. And in teaching, there has to be at least there has to be a therapist part of the teaching content that you can have other people teaching parts of it. So, for example, um, a course that I've hosted on the group I work with, Psych Maven, has had co-taught by Whitney and James Owens. It's on the Enneagram. Now,
Mhm.
Whitney's a licensed therapist, and James has a master's degree in leadership and divinity. So he meets, because he has a master's degree in a different discipline, he meets qualifications as a teacher, but he couldn't solo teach the course. It had to be a therapist
Mhm.
and him together doing that. And so, but he could be a stated teacher on it because he was qualified in different ways to teach on the material, and it was being taught with a mental health provider.
Mm.
But different disciplines require different things. That's why it depends.
Okay. Well, that's very, very interesting. I'm sure we could talk a little bit more, but is there anything before we wrap up this subject, do we go to the one last thing? Anything that you think's important that we missed, or did we cover enough to get people started, or how would people get started? Maybe is the
The
wrap up
biggest thing I'd
question.
recommend people, if you really want to do a deep dive on this, I've got a full course that covers this along with non-CE trainings for like non-professionals. So it's one of
Mhm.
my main courses that I host on Psych Maven. It's called Profitable Mental Health Trainings, and James will have a link for that in the show
Yep.
notes. And I, I that course started. The initial title of that course was profitable CE trainer, I think, or something like that. I can't remember now. Or profitable CE starter kit. Uh, and it's gone through different iterations because the first, the first version of the course was just teaching people how to create continuing education. And then I had a lot of people take the course that were wanting to put things together for lay audiences of how do I do like an experiential thing for like a course for it. So I added to the course and teaches both now. But a lot of people that still take the course are doing it because they want to learn how to do CEs for other therapists. And that's not exclusively what we teach in the course, but it's a big part of it. And I've got a lot of, I've never had anybody, we offer a 30-day money back guarantee for the course. And so if you're looking at it, you're checking it out. Here's the thing, you can buy the course and test it. If you don't like it or it doesn't feel like it's meeting your needs, as long as you request a refund within 30 days, you get a full refund. At this point, I've never had anyone request a refund because they didn't like the course. I've had people request refunds because they said, I bought this and I realized I have no time to get to it, or I
Mhm.
overspent my course budget. But those are the only refunds I've gotten requests for. People were like, I'm overwhelmed with all the other things I'm doing right now. I realized that I needed to not spend this money on this. That's the only reason. I've never had anyone go through the course say this wasn't good enough for what I was looking for. Now, I expect the law of statistics means somebody sometime will probably say
Yeah.
this was crap, but it hasn't been my feedback so far. So I feel very confident about the course.
Great.
And if you want to learn it, that's I call it a soup to nuts course or nut to soup to nuts. Yeah, that's it. So
Uh,
like one into the other of figuring it out. So if you want to learn more about it, that's what I have to offer. Occasionally, if you're on the Site Maven email list, occasionally we'll do a webinar with some little tidbits in it. But the course is available to buy at any point. It's a great course.
yeah.
Uh,
I've taken it, and I really, I was impressed by how much work you put into it. So it was really good.
yeah. Um, but if you want to learn more, that's it. But another bit to start too, if you want go to the free guide on this that I mentioned a few times. That will give you an idea of like if I'm wanting to do something in Pennsylvania, what's a good like approval for me to look at to start with. NBCC is one of the more flexible ones. National Board Certified Counselors. There are national ones for psychologists and social workers and different state associations. Depending on where you are, it may make sense to do different things, but that guide's a good starting place to think through.
Cool. All right. Well, let's move to the one thing we want you to know. And the one thing I want you to know is I love the icing and cake analogy. Your the cake is great, and and the icing is great, but what makes them great is them together. Like
Yeah.
the good content, the transformation, the growth that they're gonna get from the course or the CE, and then the icing that just puts it all together is the course content that you can have a continued education unit for, whatever it's
Yeah.
called. Like
Yeah.
that analogy was really great. So if you're planning on doing something like this, it's not just the content, it's not just the CEUs, it's
Mhm.
them together. So
Yeah.
that's my one thing. How about you, David? Do you have a one thing you want people to remember from the episode?
It People often are hesitant to this because they feel it's going to be too hard, and it's not. I did this as a novice. I didn't do it very efficiently when I started, and it's one of the reasons I created the course is to help people do it more efficiently.
Mm,
It's very achievable. I wouldn't go so far to say it's easy because it's not necessarily easy. There is a lot of like you have to be willing to fill out some paperwork and to follow up, on applications, and because a lot of these organizations aren't very good at processing your paperwork quickly, and you've got to be a squeaky wheel.
mm,
But you don't have to be brilliant, or you just have to be persistent.
mm.
And if you're willing to be persistent in this, is very doable for people at all different levels of skill and all that. And people have come up to me over the years when I'm doing a live event, a self-sponsored live event. People are like, "How are you doing this?" I'm like, "I just am." And I don't mean this to be like a humble brag sort of thing. It didn't come from necessarily any particular brilliance I had, I don't think. It was just I just was willing to stick with it and show up. And it's, a friend of mine who went through the approval process wasn't quite as successful because he got really frustrated and it was hard for him to stick with it.
Mhm.
And he's like, they're being ridiculous about this and what they're asking for. I'm like, yeah, they are.
As they tend to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and he goes, how are you getting this done? I go, I'm just willing to put up with it.
Mm.
Like for him, he had a strong sense of injustice of what they were asking him for. And I'm like, I'm not looking for justice in these. I don't look for justice in bureaucracy. I just expect that it's like going to the DMV.
Mhm.
I just got to get it done.
You gotta do it.
Yeah. But if you're willing to do that, this is very achievable. And so for those interested, do check out the course, Profitable Mental
Yeah.
Health Training Course, link in the show notes. And with the 30-day money back guarantee, I never want this. What I tell people is I never want this to be a bait and switch. I never want to be, you spend this money and like, you're
Mhm,
trapped.
mhm.
I want to give people plenty of window to buy it, to look at it, to, to kick the tires, take out for a test drive. If it feels like it can transform you, then I think you'll be happy with it. And if
Cool.
it's not, then I'm okay.
Well,
But
great.
yeah,
Man, this has been a great conversation, something that I've been interested in for a while, and people I've been talking to have been interested in it. And so, David, thanks for giving us your wisdom on this. And thanks for doing that.
yeah. Well, James, awesome.
So this is James with Dr. David Hall for the Scaling Therapy Practice. Thanks for joining us on the episode. Remember to take small steps every day that leads to big growth.
Psych Maven is proud to support the Scaling Therapy Practice podcast. And if you are someone looking for ideas that are tailored to your own personal style on how to scale and grow your own impact and income as a mental health provider, we hope you might check out our free online assessment. If you go to stp.psychmaven.com, you can take our free personal inventory and find out what your builder type is as a helping professional. This assessment is quick and fun, and it comes with tons of customized resources with your results, so you can discover the best ways to scale that match your own personality. Find the assessment at stp.psychmaven.com. That is stp.psychmaven.com. Have fun with it.
Thank you for listening to the Scaling Therapy Practice. I hope you enjoyed the show. I want to remind you that the content shared today is for general information and entertainment purposes only. Opinions given should not be considered as legal or tax advice. If you need a professional advice in those areas, please consult with a licensed attorney or accountant. But thank you so much for listening. The Scaling Therapy Practice is part of the SciCraft Network.